Test, 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 test.
Chère captionneuse français, juste pour vérifier comment vous m'entendez. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Pourriez-vous s'il vous plaît écrire ce que je dis? 1, 2, 3. Ceci est un test pour le français. Ceci est un test pour le français.
Good morning, everyone. May I ask those of you still standing to take your seats so that we start our meeting on time. Thank you. On behalf of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People, I warmly welcome all esteemed panelists and participants, including Indigenous peoples representatives, member states, national human rights institutions and regional human rights bodies, NGOs, academic institutions, OECHR, Indigenous fellows and guarantees, and others. It is my pleasure to chair this session on discussing the role of national human rights institutions in achieving the ends of the Declaration. This agenda item is the very testimony of recognizing the pivotal role the national and regional human rights institutions play in bridging international human rights standards with practical realities on the ground. These institutions are not only monitors and advocates, but they are facilitators of dialogue, enablers of participation, and defenders of Indigenous peoples' rights. EMRIP's amended mandate through the Human Rights Council Resolution 3325 in 2016 further emphasizes on this role and need for an enhanced engagement with national and regional human rights bodies. The central aim of today's panel discussion is therefore to identify areas for strengthening collaboration between national human rights institutions which are compliant with the Paris Principles, the regional human rights bodies, and the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. It will provide an opportunity to exchange good practices and challenges relating to their work at country-level engagement with indigenous peoples' rights with the following objectives. First, to assess the key role played by national human rights institutions in promoting legal and policy reform nationally, aiming at effective implementation of the Declaration. Discuss their central role in furthering the effective participation of indigenous peoples in decision-making processes on issues that affect them. Explore strategies and sharing good practices on how to engage effectively with indigenous human rights mechanisms, human rights treaty bodies, and the Universal Periodic Review, particularly on using the Declaration as a tool for interpreting states' obligations under international human rights law. Assessing good practices adopted by NHRIs and regional human rights bodies in monitoring, reporting on the implementation of the rights of indigenous peoples, especially on their key role in adopting anti-discrimination measures as per Article 15C of the Declaration. Explore successful instances of collaborative efforts between them and indigenous peoples at national level, and also assess the potential for future expansion and strengthening of such partnerships. It will also explore the challenges and barriers in effective implementation of the Declaration and indigenous peoples' effective participation, with emphasis on discussing and identifying the structural and institutional barriers nationally that hinder such meaningful participation. I would like to invite our speakers to share concrete examples of how national human rights institutions have successfully collaborated with indigenous peoples at national level. Let's also explore together how these partnerships can be further strengthened and expanded to drive broader and lasting change. Furthermore, we call upon them to reflect, discuss how such initiatives have promoted indigenous peoples' participation in shaping policies, advocating for rights, and ensuring accountability at national and regional levels, giving primacy to the voices of indigenous peoples. As we move forward, I encourage our panel to propose actionable recommendations that can help promote the wider adoption of effective practices. Let's also address the key barriers identified during our discussions with the aim of advancing the implementation of the declaration in meaningful and practical ways. Today, we have 5 distinguished speakers with us, each bringing a wealth of experience, knowledge, and insights into this important discussion. We are honored that you've accepted our invitation and taken the time to join us today, and I want to thank you and give you a warm welcome once again. It's my pleasure now to invite Mr. Andres Einar Broderstad to take the floor as the representative of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions Indigenous Peoples Caucus. Just to say a few words about the caucus. It was established in October 2024 and co-convened by the Norwegian National Human Rights Institution. It brings together 22 national human rights institutions committed to advancing indigenous people's rights through peer exchange, advocacy, and capacity building, ensuring indigenous rights remain central to Ghana's work and the global human rights agenda. Mr. Broderstad is a lawyer and advisor at the Norwegian Human Rights Institution. He has previously served as the deputy judge in the district court and as an advisor in the Norwegian Customs Directorate and the Police Directorate. His current focus includes, among others, indigenous rights, freedom of expression, the right to privacy, and freedom of religion. Mr. Broderstad, you have the floor for 7 minutes.
Distinguished colleagues and participants, it's an honor to join you today on behalf of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, GUNDRIP. We thank the expert mechanism for the invitation to contribute to this important discussion. GUNDRIP is the international network of national human rights institutions, NHRIs. Last year, GUNDRIP established a caucus on indigenous people's rights, a new initiative supporting collaboration among NHRIs in this area. At the outset, the NHRIs are independent public bodies with a broad mandate to protect and promote human rights in their countries. Some NHRIs operate as ombudsmen or commissions, which can consider human rights complaints in individual cases, while other NHRIs work with human rights at a systemic level only. And some are hybrid institutions. NHRIs are uniquely placed to promote the implementation of UNDRIP within their states, and there are undoubtedly many measures that could strengthen the implementation of UNDRIP, but it's not our intention here to provide an exhaustive review of all potential actions. But to start, ensuring that the structure and work of the NHRI itself is in line with UNDRIP is a fundamental step. This includes that NHRIs are accessible to indigenous peoples, reflects indigenous perspectives in their own operations, and uphold high standards for consultation and participation. For example, the Norwegian NHRI has established a permanent office in Govdegano, in the heart of Sami territory, to ensure a visible and consistent presence in indigenous areas. There are also Sami representatives on the Norwegian NHRI's board and advisory committee. The Australian Human Rights Commission has a dedicated commissioner mandated to monitor and promote indigenous rights and provide reports to the government. The Danish NHRI has established a permanent office in Nuuk, Kalaallit, Nunat, Greenland, and has a very close collaboration with the Human Rights Council of Greenland. The Danish NHRI also has a board member appointed by the Human Rights Council of Greenland. This is just some examples, and this can be said of many NHRIs. Assessing national laws, policies, and practices against the standard of UNDRIP is another key role of the NHRIs. Through monitoring, reporting, and formal advice, NHRIs can help ensure that domestic frameworks align with the declaration. The Finnish NHRI has continuously stressed the importance of and respect for self-determination of the Sami and the process of FPIC when the recently renewed Sami Parliament Act was drafted. The Australian NHRI has adopted a principled approach to implementation of the UNDRIP, identifying 4 core principles which underlies the 46 articles, and then using these as a thematic focus areas to guide advocacy and assessment of laws and policies. NHRIs have also played a crucial role in advocating for UNDRIP to be incorporated into domestic legislation, as well as national implementation plans and strategies. NHRIs have an important role in promoting the visibility of indigenous peoples in national statistics. and appropriate governance of indigenous data. The Danish Institute for Human Rights has partnered with indigenous organizations to develop and promote the Indigenous Navigator, a tool for community-led data collection grounded in UNDRIP. Danish Institute has also supported efforts to foster dialogue and collaboration between indigenous people, national statistical offices, and national human rights institutions, helping to bridge citizen-generated data with official statistics and to promote more inclusive and representative data systems. Defending indigenous rights when they are threatened by specific developments or projects is an essential function of NHRIs. In Honduras, the NHRI intervened when an emergency detention center was planned on indigenous land without free, prior, and informed consent of local indigenous communities. It supported peaceful protests, conducted site inspection, and formally warned the government of the potential human rights violation. Similarly, in Norway, the NHRI criticized delays in implementing a Supreme Court judgment concerning wind power developments in Sami areas, provided advice to the parties in the subsequent mediation processes. NHRIs can provide a platform for indigenous people to effectively participate in decision-making process which affect them. Several NHRIs have encouraged states and corporations to engage in meaningful processes and dialogue with indigenous peoples prior to decision-making. In the Philippines, the NHRIs has conducted dialogues and monitoring with indigenous communities affected by both natural and human-made hazards in central and southern Philippines, with the aim of documenting their experience for policy recommendations and reform. NHRIs also participate in international forums and follow up on the implementation of recommendations. Given the special standing of NHRIs within the UN system, and the access many NHRIs have to the government, NHRIs often act as a bridge builder between domestic and global accountability efforts. NHRIs regularly make submissions concerning indigenous rights to UN treaty bodies, special rapporteurs, the Permanent Forum, and EMRIP, and help ensure that observations and guidance from these bodies are taken seriously by governments. We have observed instances where states disregarded recommendations and measures proposed by international monitoring mechanism. As a result, little to no progress is made in improving the situation. In this context, NHRI play a vital role in promoting these recommendations, ensuring that they are recognized and understood within their countries. NHRIs can serve as a vital partner in implementing these recommendations. Finally, raising awareness about UNDRIP within state authorities, among indigenous communities, and across the general public is an ongoing responsibility. This includes clarifying the legal and political significance of the declaration and countering misconception that it grants special privileges or rights to indigenous peoples that others do not enjoy. Indigenous issues often rank low on the political agenda, but NHRI can use their institutional weight to shine a spotlight on indigenous issues. Awareness raising may take form of community dialogue, public campaigns, media engagement, or educational materials. In all of these efforts, NHRIs plays a unique role as an independent institution with a mandate to promote human rights for all, including indigenous peoples. Thank you. Gitu.
I thank you, Mr. Broderstan, for your statement. May I ask the next speakers, please, to speak slowly to enable the translators to translate your statements. I would now like to give the floor to Madam Hawe Haman Buba, who is a commissioner at the Cameroon Human Rights Commission. Madam Buba is an expert in human rights and humanitarian action. She's also an expert member of the Working Group of Indigenous Populations and Minorities of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Madam Buba, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank EMRIP for instituting this panel, for instituting the panel on the National Human Rights Institution. I think for some years now, we have been participating. Few national human rights institutions have been participating in EMRIP for the last 3 years. And I realized that EMRIP recognized their presence and decided to organize this panel. So I'm grateful for that. At least the non-RIS can contribute to human rights, to the indigenous people's rights, advancing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I will talk about the role that our institution is playing for the implementation of the UNDRIP. The Cameroon Human Rights Commission is an independent institution with a broad mandate of promotion, protection of human rights, and it also serves as the national mechanism for the prevention of torture. It is established by law, voted by the parliament. The institution has gone through several reforms from 1992 when it was a committee, and it went through a reform in 2004 established by a law to become the National Commission for Human Rights and Freedom. And in July 2019, it went again through another reform to align it with the Paris Principles to become the Cameroon Human Rights Commission. It works through 3 mechanisms: the mechanism for protection, promotion, and prevention of torture. It also works through thematics. And one of the thematics is the rights of indigenous people. And also this thematic has a focal point who is an indigenous person. I'm the one here, sitting here. And our role is to monitor indigenous people's human rights situations in Cameroon. We monitor this situation through focal persons from indigenous organizations in the different regions. The Commission has regional branches in the 10 regions of the country and 1 divisional office in one of the divisions that has a lot of ethnic conflicts. So we build the capacity and support the work of indigenous organizations through technical and financial support. We participate in the activities to give them more visibility, and we also permit them to participate in almost all the activities of the Cameroon Human Rights Commission. We commemorate the International Day of World Indigenous People and issue a statement with strong recommendations to different stakeholders, such as like the government, the UN system, civil society organizations, and also indigenous organizations. And the Commission can be seized by indigenous people's organizations or any witnesses of human rights violations happening in these communities verbally by writing or through its free tool number 1523. And this matter will be investigated and prosecuted if the allegations are founded. Many cases since 2021 have been resolved in the East and Adamawa regions of Cameroon, where we had cases of murder, harassment, arbitrary arrest, seizure of properties, issues of land and resources, and domination of indigenous people by other communities. Such issues where the Commission resolved them in a very favorable manner for indigenous people. The Commission is an advisory body to the government on human rights issues. We also monitor and evaluate the government's international human rights obligation by carrying out, for example, the consultation with the civil society to make inputs to its universal periodic report and also present a shadow report when the country was examined in 2023. The Commission received the recommendations and carried out a review and made propositions to the government on pertinent recommendations, such as those pertaining to ratification of human rights instruments. Out of the 220 recommendations accepted, 8 were in favor of indigenous people, and these recommendations were shared to the various stakeholders for implementation. Since this year, we have been strengthening the capacity of civil society organizations with the support of the UN Center for Human Rights and Democracy, which is an organ of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, to monitor, to train them how to monitor and the implementation of the recommendations of the UPR. The process is still ongoing. The Commission also has a role to, I've already said it, to evaluate government action in fulfilling its international human rights obligation. And since the adoption of the UNDRIP in 2007, the government has made some strides towards its implementation. In 2008, the Prime Minister, head of government, passed a decree to make official the commemoration of the International Day of World Indigenous People, and by so doing recognizes their existence. Indigenous issues are under an institution, a ministerial department, the Ministry of Social Affairs, the Directorate of National Solidarity. The ministry has two programs, the Interministerial Committee, which supervises programs and actions in favor of indigenous people. This committee meets during the week of the celebration of the International Day of Indigenous People to evaluate the actions, projects, and programs that have been realized during the past year for indigenous, in favor of indigenous people. The government department also have the National Plan for the Development of Indigenous People, which is also a very broad plan with several axes, major axes on right to land and resources, social and economic rights, civil and political rights. It is, and it is they are encouraging international organizations, civil society organizations that intervene in indigenous questions, and the indigenous peoples organization to work respecting, the plan and working in those very important axes. We also, the Ministry of Wildlife and Forests has also signed a memorandum of understanding with an indigenous organization in the East region to give access to the backup communities, access to carry out their traditional activities in 4 major parks in the East region, including the Lobeke National Park, and quotas also in the School of the Forest and Wildlife. They have also a quota in the National Police Training Schools. In terms of participation, indigenous people have mayors, they have councillors in local governments, and also in the regional councils. We have alternate parliamentarians. We don't have a specific law on indigenous people, but indigenous people issues are taken care in sectoral texts and strategies. So I think we also work with the UN in implementing the UNDRIP also, because we have the UN Center for Human Rights and Democracy in Central Africa, which gives us capacity building, also help us to train civil society organizations. We also work with civil society. We have 2 major networks of civil society of about 800 civil society organizations, and we work with them. They help us in some of our activities in regions where we are not found. So we collaborate with them. So maybe for now I will end here. I think recommendations was strengthening the legal framework aimed at protecting the rights of indigenous people, stronger legal protection measures aimed at holding perpetrators of human rights violations against indigenous people in terms of right to land and resources. And the Commission, for its part, will spare no effort to continue the promotion and protection of human rights and the human rights of indigenous people in particular. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Madam Buba, for your statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Grigory Diyukarev, who is the Commissioner for the Rights of Small Numbers Indigenous Peoples of Krasnoyarsk Territory Russia Federation. Mr. Diyukarev is a member of the Nenets indigenous peoples from the Arctic, and he brings over 25 years of experience in human rights advocacy. Mr. Diyukarev, you have the floor for 7 minutes.
Уважаемый господин председатель.
Chair, allow me to express my gratitude for the organization of this discussion and the attention it devotes to the indigenous peoples of the Russian Federation. My statement will deal with the role of the Commissioner for the Rights of Small-Numbered Indigenous Peoples in the Russian Federation. This is an additional form of government guarantee, allowing access to justice to be more effective and more acceptable in cultural terms. I would like to underscore that this mechanism was created at the initiative of indigenous peoples themselves and through consultation with them. Let me explain the legal context briefly. Article 69 of the Russian Federation's constitution guarantees the rights of small-numbered indigenous peoples in accordance with the norms of international law. Development of this activity is ongoing in our this article is ongoing in our legislation. There are minimum standards ensured, and then the regions elaborate more detailed support measures according to the local specifics. This Institute of Ombudsmen is such an example of regional activity. This was made possible following a decision by the president and the development of this institution in the Russian Federation. Various measures to protect and promote the rights of indigenous peoples in 5 regions in Russia. These are the Krasnoyarsk territory, Sakha, Sakhalinsk region, Kamchatka, and the Khanty-Mansiysk region. They have all set up the position of independent commissioners for small-numbered indigenous peoples. These institutions are fully in line with the Paris Principles on the status of national human rights institutions. The emergence of these institutions in our country is in accordance with the purposes and principles, the letter and spirit of UNDRIP. And this directly facilitates the achievement of Articles 1, 5, 18, 19, 33, 34, and 38 of the Declaration. The Declaration, the Constitution, and our national laws, these are what guide me. I would like to thank the expert mechanism for their quality studies on a variety of topics. This includes access to justice. Among these studies, our institution is given as an example of a positive practice. It should be noted that commissioners on small-numbered indigenous peoples appoint representatives from these small-numbered indigenous peoples themselves. These individuals are appointed as commissioners, that is, and their candidature is put forward following consultation with indigenous groups. In accordance with the Constitution, they are independent and not subordinate to any government agency. Our main role is to ensure additional guarantees of state protection for the rights and legitimate interests of indigenous peoples. It is in our authority to demand from government agencies, local government, and high-ranking officials that they observe the rights and legitimate interests of indigenous peoples in all areas of life. Our mandate includes the consideration of complaints and communications for solution and follow-up by government bodies and officials, the verification of complaints and communications, unfettered access to places of detention, that is, where inmates are held following commission of a crime, monitoring of the implementation of federal and regional legislation on indigenous peoples, making proposals on regulatory acts, developing long-term strategies and policies and support measures for indigenous peoples. We also make proposals on enhancing government programs for the sustainable development of indigenous peoples. Sometimes we defend the rights of indigenous persons in court. We have a mandate for practical assistance to persons, families, and communities. And we also correct systemic mistakes in our legislation. Our institution is both an ombudsman and a mediator between government, Indigenous peoples, and business. My colleagues and I, the other commissioners, we constantly visit the traditional living places of Indigenous peoples. This includes reindeer herding camps, small fishing and hunting camps, remote villages and settlements, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from any asphalt roads, airports, or river or railway stations. We do our best to get to everyone who needs our help. We often engage in awareness raising among Indigenous peoples about their rights. The law obliges us to become acquainted with the living conditions, the daily life, and traditions of Indigenous peoples. We are obliged to delve into their traditional economy, their culture, education system, healthcare, and communal services. We study the socio-demographic conditions, pension issues, labor, and other rights. We devote attention to the right to a favorable environment, biological diversity, and we often act as a mediator between Indigenous peoples and businesses. Where there are violations of Indigenous peoples' rights by businesses, we unconditionally support Indigenous peoples. Following these visits and analysis of complaints and communications, an annual report is drawn up, an annual commissioner's report, and this is submitted to the local parliament. This includes statistics on the number and subject matter of communications. Also, it covers human rights protection practice, both positive and negative. Recommendations are made to the governor, to the chairman of the government, ministers, and other officials on enhancing the living conditions of Indigenous peoples. The report also includes recommendations on regulatory acts for the protection of Indigenous small-numbered peoples' rights. If rights have been violated, I send an official letter to the prosecutor's office in our region, to the police and other law enforcement structures. This is the most effective approach. In some cases, as I was saying, we act in court in defense of Indigenous rights. We also engage in legal awareness raising among Indigenous peoples and attempt to enhance their expert capacities. This institution has often been mentioned as a positive example from Russia, and this includes our School of Public Diplomacy for Indigenous Peoples. I can assure you that commissioners are frequently in attendance at this platform. We are often turned to by government agencies with requests for advice and expert assessments, as we are highly qualified and our life experience and knowledge are highly in demand in various sectors. For instance, I am a member of the Public Council of the Federal Ministry for the Development of the Far East and the Arctic. I am also a member of the Expert Advisory Council of the Federal Agency for Minority Affairs. This allows us to uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples at the highest level of state. Let me give you some figures by way of conclusion. In Krasnoyarsk territory, there are about 3 million people. Of these, small-numbered Indigenous peoples number just 16,500. This is about 0.5% of the total population. By way of recommendation to EMRIP, I would like to propose a thematic study on the role of national human rights defense institutions, NHRIs, and representative bodies of Indigenous peoples in protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
I thank you, Mr. Deyukare, for your statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Julia Wapoti, Tatau Urutai, Tino Rangatiratanga at New Zealand Human Rights Commission. Ms. Wapoti is a prominent Maori leader and an advocate for Indigenous rights and social justice. She has previously served as a director on the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Historical Abuse in state care and has worked with the Office of the Children's Commission on Safe and Effective Justice Advisory Group. I now like to give the floor to Ms. Wapoti. You have 7 minutes.
Ko tai mano waru rau wha te kau te tau. I wai tohunga te tiriti o Waitangi. Nā te karona nā nai whakairo. Nana hoki e tūraki e. Tuia te rangi e tū nei, tuia te papa e takato nei, tuia te tapuai o ngā tipuna ki a tātou e hui nei. Tui, 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 tuia, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this land and from around the world. I am a Ngāti Porou woman from Aotearoa, and I speak on behalf of Te Kāhui Tika Tangata, New Zealand's Human Rights Commission. 1 year ago, I reported the Commission's concerns about the winding back of human rights in Aotearoa. Matters have not improved since, and the New Zealand government continues to undermine Indigenous people's rights and Te Tiriti o Waitangi through a program of law and policy measures. It does so against the warnings of the Waitangi Tribunal, against the advice of its own officials, and against the will of its citizens. Last November saw what was estimated to be New Zealand's largest ever protest in opposition to the government's attempt to redefine Te Tiriti o Waitangi and Indigenous rights. As the NHRI, it is our role to hold every New Zealand government to account, to promote and to protect the international human rights framework, and to ensure that every administration honours the duties it bears to tangata whenua, the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand. The New Zealand government was slow to support the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples under previous administrations, but its commitment to UNDRIP has since been progressed by administrations from both sides of Parliament. We are disappointed that the current government is stepping back from its commitment. Te Kāhui Tika Tangata, New Zealand's Human Rights Commission, is an A-status NHRI. In 2027, we will celebrate 50 years as New Zealand's national human rights institution. As NHRIs, it is our role to promote and protect the human rights framework. The Declaration is an integral part of that framework and is absolutely core to our work. NHRIs can act as connectors between the state and citizen and between the national and international human rights systems. Our role is to help our communities connect with, understand and assert their rights. In the New Zealand context, we often do this by highlighting the links between the Declaration and our founding treaty, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Our former Commissioner, Eri Hapati Murchi, took part in the UN working group meetings here in Geneva when the Declaration was being drafted. We still draw on her words to help highlight the value and relevance of the Declaration to our people back home and the other side of the world. We can also help our communities' voices to be heard, using the opportunities that we have as NHRIs at the international level to highlight their concerns. For example, in preparing our shadow report to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination Committee, we've met with a number of community organisations. We have heard their concerns about New Zealand's regression on Te Tiriti and Indigenous rights, and about rising levels of racism experienced by Māori. Our report to the CERD will reflect what we've heard. Increasingly, we need to combat misconceptions about the rights of Indigenous peoples. This is why we rely on international bodies to provide clear statements of what human rights require. We can then use these to remind lawmakers of their obligations. For example, the New Zealand government has a law reform program set on redefining and removing legal and constitutional recognition of Te Tiriti and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Proponents of these reforms argue that they are necessary to protect the equal rights of all New Zealanders. Drawing on the statements of the CERD and the EMRIP, the Commission has argued in our submissions that this is a flawed approach and a misconception of human rights. As a human rights organisation, we aim to uphold Te Tiriti and Indigenous rights in our structure, processes and activities. A decade ago, we made an explicit commitment to becoming a Tiriti-based organisation. We've established a shared leadership model with the chief executive role shared by Indigenous and non-Indigenous co-leaders. We've created a contracted role to ensure there is an Indigenous rights expertise at governance level. This is because successive governments have declined to appoint an Indigenous rights commissioners to our board. Until that occurs, we will continue to contract in that expertise. We are building Tiriti-based relationships. We have a formal partnership and a shared work program with the National Iwi Chairs Forum, a national body of tribal leaders. As an independent NHRI, we've worked collaboratively with both Indigenous organisations and with government, for example, on the EMRIP's 2019 country visit, and worked towards a national action plan for the declaration. Although the government has stepped away from it, we remain committed to continue this work to put the declaration into action. Last year, we worked with a range of partners on a constitutional conference looking at what changes are needed to fully protect human rights in Te Tiriti and Aotearoa. Research conducted by the Human Rights Commission in 2024 aimed at understanding New Zealanders' views on Te Tiriti o Waitangi showed that 71% of New Zealanders believe that it's important that Te Tiriti is protected within our laws. Furthermore, 90.2% believe it's important for human rights to be protected in our laws and constitution. While successive governments have ignored UN recommendations to progress constitutional discussions, we can keep trying to push these issues along. We face challenges, including around resourcing and funding. Speaking out on Indigenous rights can attract criticisms and even calls for our abolishment, both from within and outside government. We have been criticised for attending the EMRIP session, even though this is a core aspect of our role. A new unique feature of NHRIs is we are independent, but we are also funded by the government. Our commissioners are appointed by the government. We are government funded. At the same time, our role is to hold the government to account. While the government can't tell us what to do, how much we are able to do, of course, depends on our resourcing. We know that many human rights defenders face much harsher struggles, but even in countries like ours that are supposedly rights respecting, the independence of NHRIs can be a delicate balance. We must protect our independence. We must continue to strengthen and prioritise our work on Indigenous people's rights, using the Declaration as our standard of reference. We must promote and protect these rights, even when, and especially when, governments seek to diminish and delete them. We must do this even though these are the same governments that fund us. We can be supported by this, by EMRIP, Permanent Forum and Special Rapporteur. When these bodies, the CERD and other treaty bodies, make strong statements on the state's obligation, this provides us with valuable tools and levers for our work. We welcome the creation of the Ganri Indigenous Caucus and the opportunity this offers for support, information sharing and collaboration. And of course, we offer our experience and contribution into our collective space. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa.
I thank you, Ms. Wapoti, for your statement. Last but not least, through video recording, we will listen to the presentation of His Excellency Edmund Bon Tai Soon, Chair of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights and representative of Malaysia to the AICHR. Edmund is a practicing lawyer with over 25 years of experience working with businesses, state and non-governmental organizations to promote and protect human rights. He served as Malaysia's representative to AICHR from 2016 to 2017 and was reappointed in 2024. He currently chairs the commission under the Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship. I would now like
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Although I wish I could have delivered my intervention in person, I thank you for allowing me to say a few words through this recording for the 18th session of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, in 2007 was historic. It affirms the dignity, rights, and agency of indigenous peoples globally. All 10 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, voted in favor. However, nearly 2 decades later, there are immense challenges in the realization of the declaration. Regional human rights institutions, such as the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, ICHA, have an important role to play in advancing the UNDRIP. We are situated between the United Nations and national governments such that we can bridge global norms and domestic reality. We can help localize, vernacularize, and operationalize international instruments such as the UNDRIP while reinforcing accountability and coherence across the region. 2025 is an important year not only for Malaysia as the chair of ASEAN, but for ASEAN as a regional bloc. In Kuala Lumpur recently, ASEAN adopted a new vision, ASEAN 2045, Our Shared Future. It is a forward-looking blueprint that charts the course of our region for 20 years. Together with ASEAN strategic plans, it will guide the work of ASEAN institutions, including ICHA, to build a more resilient, inclusive, innovative, dynamic, and people-centered ASEAN. The participation of groups in vulnerable and marginalized situations is also underscored to ensure their full potential and to improve the quality of life for them, ensuring shared prosperity and leaving no one behind. Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship theme, inclusivity and sustainability, reflects this commitment. Aligned with our Madani concept, which envisions a compassionate, inclusive, sustainable, and prosperous society. Inclusivity is not just a principle. It is also a test of our current systems, our laws, our governance. It demands that we center the voices made vulnerable and marginalized, women, children, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, orang asli, orang asal, migrant workers, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, ethnic, religious, linguistic, and gender minorities, and human rights and environmental rights defenders. They have the right to participate, contribute, and benefit equitably from the political, social, cultural, and economic developments within ASEAN. It is when we design systems and processes that truly serve the most vulnerable that we build a society that works for all. Sustainability, in turn, is rooted in the respect for human rights and environmental stewardship. It cannot just be a buzzword in today's time and age. Without respecting and protecting the rights of people and the planet, there can be no fair, just, or lasting development. According to the World Health Organization, it is estimated that over 216 million indigenous peoples call the Southeast Asia land surface home. The communities often face intersecting challenges from land dispossession and displacement to limited access to essential services, representation, remedies, and justice. Further, and unfortunately, many indigenous communities are not recognized as such by their governments. Yet they hold traditional and indigenous knowledge and culture that are important to us. Lessons from indigenous ecological stewardship is also badly needed by our region. The UNDRIP is not merely aspirational. It is increasingly being used as a guiding instrument to understand state obligations and as a baseline to develop policies and frameworks concerning the promotion and protection of those rights. Further, it supports their right to participate in decision-making on matters that affect their lives, land, culture, and resources. Meaningful participation needs to go far beyond mere consultation. It requires representation, empowerment, informed consent, and equity in outcomes. Since its establishment in 2009, ICHA has served as ASEAN's overarching human rights mechanism. Its convening power has organized more than 155 activities across 40 thematic areas, bringing representatives of government, civil society, national human rights institutions, the private sector, and indigenous communities for dialogue. In December 2024, ICHA hosted its workshop on best practices in promoting indigenous and traditional knowledge in responding and adapting to the impact of climate change. Held in Manila, the Philippines, participants examined the impact of the global climate emergency on indigenous groups and traditional communities, highlighting how their unique perspectives can help address this challenge directly. The sharing of experiences and good practices, particularly by the indigenous from other climate vulnerable areas, such as the Pacific Island states, was extremely valuable to ASEAN. This year, ICHA is looking forward to the much anticipated adoption of the proposed ASEAN Declaration on the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This landmark initiative recognizes the interconnectedness of human rights and the environment, including the traditional and indigenous knowledge and techniques that sustain climate resilience in communities. Critically, this declaration seeks to continue ASEAN's commitment in protecting the rights of groups in vulnerable and marginalized situations, including the indigenous peoples. In closing, we must greatly sustain and accelerate the enhancement of our advocacy on UNDRIP with policymakers and non-state actors to take more meaningful, inclusive, and rights-based action to protect the rights of indigenous peoples globally. Thank you.
Thank you for the video statement. Before I turn the floor to the list of speakers, let me ask my colleagues, EMRIP members, if any of you would like to speak. Yes, Sherry.
Thank you very much, Chair, for offering us the floor. And I want to thank all of the panelists for your presentation. We learned a lot about different NHRIs, and I think it's clear that NHRIs are uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between Indigenous peoples and governments and international mechanisms and keep those dialogue and conversations very active. So we appreciate you being here today and participating so meaningfully in our discussion. And I also appreciate the range of NHRI models that we heard from in the presentations. Quite a diversity from ombudspersons to Indigenous specific commissioners. And I think what we can take away is that there is significant flexibility in institutional design, and that can enable very specific culturally grounded approaches and protection of Indigenous people's rights. We heard also some key challenges that have been raised in multiple contexts. Resource limitations is everywhere, and so we all recognize that, and a growing problem of political interference. So thank you, Aotearoa, New Zealand, for those comments. And I think we also, everywhere in the world, experience lack of dedicated legislation on Indigenous peoples, as we heard from Cameroon. And we all share the need for increased data visibility and disaggregated statistics, which was the theme of yesterday as well. And so I have a couple questions, if you could think and offer some remarks at the end. One of the pieces that I think about often is institutional independence. So in contexts where NHRIs are government funded, yet tasked with holding the government accountable at the same time, that can create some difficulties and complexities. So what strategies have you found in your contexts that have been effective in safeguarding that kind of independence in often challenging environments? And then secondly, what are your strategies for monitoring the long-term impact and effectiveness of your recommendations? What kind of tracking do you do, or are you able to do over long-term, looking at changes to Indigenous people's situations in your countries? So thank you very much for your contributions, and I look forward to hearing the contributions from the floor as well. And thank you again for being part of our conversation.
Thank you. Any other EMRIP member? I don't see. I now turn the floor to the list of speakers. May I give the floor to Norway?
Thank you, Chair. We thank the panelists for their interventions. National human rights institutions and NHRIs play an important role in the effective implementation of human rights, often acting as a bridge builder between the international community, the state, civil society, and other actors. The UN recommends that all states have a national human rights institution to protect and promote human rights within their jurisdiction. The National Human Rights Institution in Norway, or NIM in short, is an independent public body established by the Norwegian Parliament in 2015 to strengthen the implementation of human rights in Norway in accordance with the Constitution, the Human Rights Act, and international human rights law. NIM has A status according to the Paris Principles. With its independence and professional integrity, the National Human Rights Institution in Norway is an important stakeholder in the promotion and monitoring of human rights law at the domestic level. This also includes monitoring, reporting, and advising on the effective implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My government values the recommendations from NIM, such as the report on human rights protection against interference in Sami traditional areas. Norway recognizes the significant role that national human rights institutions play in raising awareness about the rights of Indigenous peoples, including promoting good practices. NIM has one of its two offices in the Sami region in Guadugaino. We appreciate that it spends a considerable part of its resources on the rights of Indigenous peoples. NHRIs can also provide relevant advice to both governments and Indigenous peoples, and it can empower Indigenous peoples to develop their own initiatives grounded in human rights. Finally, Norway welcomes the cooperation between national human rights institutions and regional human rights networks, such as the Global Alliance on National Human Rights Institutions. We encourage all efforts to facilitate collaboration between indigenous peoples, civil society, state institutions, and international bodies. I thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Articulacao de Lideranças do Povo Terrena. It's a joint statement. Yes, you have the floor.
Excelentíssimo membro do mecanismo de...
Your Excellencies, members of EMRIP and representatives of state as well as others present.
Terrena de Território Buriti e participo do mecanismo de Programa de Becas para Jovens Indígenas 2025 de Acnitude. Me dirijo a esta sessão com profunda preocupação para denunciar as situações críticas que enfrentam os pueblos indígenas em Brasil. A falta de...
The interpretation team apologizes, but the speaker is speaking Portuguese and we are not covering that language.
Pobres indígenas, violentando direitos internacionais, a paralisação do processo de marcação de ameaças de marco temporal, expõe de comunidade de evasão mineral legal de terras e de fases de vitalidades de supervivências, autonomia, violências em áreas essenciais como educação, saúde, conquistas precárias, falta de doentes bilíngues, barreiras geográficas, desertos escolar, perdidas línguas indígenas e saúde, precariedade nos serviços de escassez de profissionais, de contaminação de rios, pouca atividade legal, ameaças das comunidades. Además, as liderações indígenas continuam sendo criminalizadas, assassinadas e responsabilizadas, evidenciando grave omissão do Estado e poder de seus direitos. Apesar da existência de marcos fundamentais como a Declaração das Nações Unidas sobre os Direitos de Povos Indígenas, UNDRIP, e Convênio 169 de la OIT, os direitos dos povos indígenas seguem sendo sistematicamente violados. Esta situação continua violando os direitos fundamentais reconhecidos em direitos e instrumentos que garantiram a educação de línguas próprias e as posições de proteção desse território, como acesso a recurso natural e essencial. Recomendação ao Brasil: demarcações imediatas das terras indígenas, conforme constituições e tratados internacionais, educações intercultural de qualidade, como a Cúpula de Educação Superior, apoio a programas de deveres e escolas indígenas bilíngue, atenção digna de saúde, garantindo acesso à água limpa, infraestrutura adequada e medicamentos profissionais capacitados e efetivos de minério legal. Assegura um futuro acessível para o planeta. Muitas graças.
Thank you, and apologies for the lack of interpretation, but be sure that the statement would be posted and available for others to see. Thank you. I now give the floor to Silokoti in national government. If you are in the room, the representative.
Sierra William Hente. I am Sierra William from the Taithkotin Nation. We welcome this discussion on the role of national and regional human rights institutions. We want to share some experiences from Canada regarding the challenges of using these institutions to address violations of our human rights as protected in Declaration. The Taithkotin people know our Indigenous rights, our human rights. However, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, its provincial equivalents, are fortunately limited to only at discrimination and systemic barriers. They have no mandate to address the Declaration and whether it states compliant with it. This is a problematic gap. Fortunately, the Canadian government, as well as some provinces, have enacted the declaration into Canada's law. As part of implementation efforts, governments are created advisory bodies to monitor implementation. However, it does not appear that these bodies will not meet the standards of Paris principles. They will lack the necessary independence and adequate power, so the lack of appropriate human rights oversight institution continues. This is all the more concerning since the Canadian Supreme Court has recently held the declaration has been incorporated into Canadian law and provides a framework for interpreting Canadian law and advancing reconciliation. Canada and other states need to ensure that they have local human rights institutions that both have expressed a mandate to consider the declaration and the compliant with Paris principles, particularly those requiring independence, adequate power. This can be achieved by expanding the mandate of the existing Human Rights Commission or through the creation of the new declaration focused on commissions. We submit the expert mechanism should provide an oversight and guidance to the states on this issue so that the states can properly hold themselves to account for upholding the declaration. Sachenoya, thank you.
I thank you for the statement. I now give the floor to Inuit Circumpolar Council.
Mr. Chair. I speak on behalf of the Arctic region. Inuit and Sami welcome this timely panel discussion on the role of national and regional human rights institutions in achieving the ends of the declaration. National human rights institutions hold a vital and widely recognized role in defending, monitoring, and reporting the human rights situation in each state, region, or jurisdiction they operate in. However, we can see an unacceptable lack of resources and focus on Indigenous peoples, as well as understanding of and accountability to the rights of Indigenous peoples. We note that there are good examples of improvement of some national human rights institutions to working diligently with the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples, including some of the examples we've heard today. In Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland, the Parliament has established a Human Rights Council to advise the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and the council is structured to specifically include focus on the rights of Indigenous peoples. In Norway, the Human Rights Institution has established an office in the Sami homelands and has Sami members in its board and advisory board. Despite these examples of improvements, lack of financial support for the NHIIs to fully uphold their obligation to report and monitor the human rights situation of Indigenous peoples, both within the states they are accredited in and in other states, continues. Mr. Chair, the key pillars of the Paris principles based on which the NHIIs operate are pluralism, independence, and effectiveness. The principles include a broad mandate so that NHIIs are, among other things, able to promote and protect all human rights. The principles also include adequate resources so they have the funding, staffing, infrastructure, and institutional capacity to perform their functions and meet their responsibilities. Furthermore, a principle is international engagement, meaning that the NHIIs should contribute their knowledge and expertise to international and regional human rights bodies and mechanisms. It is unacceptable that it most often lies upon Indigenous peoples themselves to call on their NHIIs to apply the UN Declaration fully and effectively in their work and build expertise and full understanding of the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. Madam Chair, we call on the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions to, in close collaboration with Indigenous peoples, EMRIP, and the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to strengthen their accreditation mechanisms as well as their focus on Indigenous peoples. No national human rights institution should be able to obtain accreditation if they do not diligently and proactively include Indigenous peoples' rights in their mandates and work. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, we propose to consider how indigenous peoples, if they so wish, can establish their own national human rights institutions, as we understand that the current mechanisms and principles include limitations to that end. The time is now for all states that champion human rights to step up, to stand strong and work with indigenous peoples to turn around the evaluation and regression of our rights.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to the Association Changosians de France.
Distinguished delegates and member states, the indigenous rights of the Chagosians do not rest on mere assumptions. They are rooted in a profound historical and cultural context that demands recognition and respect. By leveraging the capabilities of regional human rights institutions and national human rights institutions, there exists the potential to apply pressure on the Mauritian and UK governments to acknowledge and uphold these rights. However, the interplay between regional human rights institutions and international legal bodies, such as the International Court of Justice, significantly influences the enforcement of human rights, particularly in the context of the Chagosian indigenous rights. The ICJ ruling on the sovereignty of the Chagos archipelago has indeed created substantial challenges for the promotion and protection of our rights. Regional human rights institutions may be limited in the power to enforce decisions or recommendations at the national level, especially in the context of geopolitical considerations, where member states may prioritize national interests over human rights commitments. The Chagosians, like many indigenous peoples, face systemic discrimination that diminishes our visibility and influence in both national and international human rights dialogues. This marginalization can lead to our issues being deprioritized by institutions meant to protect our rights. Even when regional human rights institutions recognize the rights of the Chagosians, the mechanisms for enforcing compliance by national governments are often weak, leading to unaddressed violations. These institutions can assist in the formulation of policies that incorporate the principles of UNDRIP into national law. This includes advocating for the protection of the Chagosians' cultural identity and rights, which is at high risk of being completely erased by the Mauritian government. Effective implementation requires the involvement of the Chagosians themselves in discussions about their rights and needs. NHRIs can ensure that indigenous people are consulted in the legal and policy reform processes promoting self-determination. Increase international pressure on states to respect indigenous rights, even in the context of sovereignty claims, is essential. This can be achieved through advocacy campaigns, reports, and partnerships with global human rights organizations. There is an urgent need for regional and international bodies to collaborate more effectively with indigenous peoples, ensuring that our voices are heard in legal and political arenas. Building coalitions with civil society and human rights organizations can amplify our unheard calls for justice. I thank you for your attention.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to the Philippines Commission on Human Rights.
Assalamu alaikum. The Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines, the country's A-status NHRI, is active in its advocacy to protect and promote the rights of indigenous peoples. The UNDRIP and national laws can provide robust protective frameworks that advocate for their rights to self-governance and self-determination. Our recent example of CHRP's advocacy and investigation mandates is in its initiative on monitoring the human rights situation of non-Moro indigenous peoples, a diverse group in Bangsamoro that is classified under the Bangsamoro Organic Law as part of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. Non-Moro indigenous peoples face issues of discrimination, exclusion, land dispossession, and face violence. This, or the dialogues and meetings conducted by the CHRP with the non-Moro indigenous peoples and the government, are documented in the CHRP's 2024 Situation Report on Non-Moro Indigenous Peoples. Our reporting function is exemplified by our engagements with international human rights mechanisms such as the treaty bodies and EMRIP. CHRP, in its submission to EMRIP for its duty or study on indigenous people's right to data, including data collection and disaggregation, emphasized that indigenous peoples must not only be subjects of data, but stewards of it. Advancing the right to data requires free, prior, and informed consent and meaningful collaboration where governments, institutions, and communities co-create systems that uphold dignity, equity, and cultural integrity. NHRIs play that crucial role as facilitator between indigenous peoples and government to ensure that indigenous peoples' rights are protected and promoted. I once again thank the organizers and our audience for this opportunity to speak in this panel. Thank you very much.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to the Danish Institute for Human Rights. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Today I speak on behalf of the Danish Institute for Human Rights, following many years of close collaboration with the Human Rights Council of Galatlit Nonad, Greenland, and recent dialogue with the Inuit Circumpolar Council. We commend the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples for addressing the critical role of NHRIs in advancing the effective implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We also commend the report and recommendations made by the former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Jose Francisco Kalitzai, after his visit to Denmark and Galatlit Nunad in 2023. Today, we wish to highlight 3 areas that are essential to strengthening the implementation of the declaration in this context. Firstly, enhancing knowledge and implementation of international standards. To ensure that Inuit fully enjoy all the human rights to which they are entitled, including the rights under the Declaration and the ILO Convention 169, it's imperative to strengthen awareness and understanding of these instruments at all levels of government and public administration. Secondly, respect, redress, repair. These words have profound meaning when it comes to addressing systematic human rights violations. For Inuit in Denmark and Galatlit Nunad, practices of involuntary contraception and the prevention of Inuit children from tracing their paternity are but some of the violations that must be addressed. We encourage authorities in Denmark to listen to Inuit to understand what respect, redress, and repair means to them. We also encourage listening to other countries and indigenous peoples and learn from their processes of healing. As a national human rights institution, we find great value in learning from other national human rights institutions through the GANRI Indigenous Peoples Caucus. Thirdly, bridging international standards with local implementation and participation. Monitoring and reporting must be grounded in data collection that respects the rights, dignity, and free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. In Galasliit Nunad, human rights and Inuit-led organizations are central to this work. However, the absence of robust and Indigenous-owned data remains a challenge. We therefore recommend the use of tools such as the Indigenous Navigator. Furthermore, bridging the gap between international standards and national reality requires representation. Therefore, we support efforts to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples in the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Social Empowerment Education Program. You have the floor.
Thank Mr. Chair. Bulabinaka, I am Vema Rokondende from Fiji and OHCHR Indigenous Fellow 2025. I'll be speaking on Agenda Item 5, stated United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including the report on the rights of Indigenous peoples to their traditional economies, and Agenda Item 8 stated Panel on National and Regional Human Rights Institutions' role in advancing Indigenous peoples' rights and in achieving the ends of the Declaration. Indigenous peoples' rights to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights, which is in Article 18 of the UNDRIP, and states' obligations to consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent to legislative and administrative decisions may affect them, which is in Article 19 and Article 32, number 2. The issue in Fiji is the Mining Act, which is on its 11th stage of review. Firstly, the 6 feet under clause in the Mining Act is a barrier to the development of financially disadvantaged resource owners. Secondly, the environment impact assessment needs to be inclusive of all resource owners at all levels of engagement, with a comprehensive, robust review of the Mining Act 1965 by 2027. Thirdly, there is the exclusion of women's participation in the decision-making process of development.
Respect for our ancestral rights. Instead of playing their veto solutions, despite the global geopolitical around climate change, conservation of ecosystems and biodiversity. And fair partnerships with coordination and mutual respect. Thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now turn the floor to the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair, and thank you, panelists. National and regional human rights institutions play a vital role in supporting the implementation of of UNDRIP. Through independent monitoring and accountability, they assess how national laws and practices align with UNDRIP standards. Many national and regional human rights institutions also offer complaint and redress mechanisms that can provide accessible justice for Indigenous peoples, particularly where formal courts are inaccessible. Through public education and awareness efforts, national and regional human rights institutions help combat discrimination and promote understanding of Indigenous peoples' rights. In their advisory capacity, they can influence legal and policy reforms in critical areas such as land rights, education, and consultation. For instance, in the Inter-American Human Rights System, the ruling of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the Saramacca people case versus Suriname requested the government to legally recognize the rights of the Saramacca people to ancestral lands. National and regional human rights institutions also contribute significantly to data collection and reporting, ensuring that Indigenous peoples' issues are visible in national and international human rights dialogues. To be effective, however, their work must be based on respectful, culturally sensitive collaboration with Indigenous peoples, including the recognition of Indigenous governance systems. National and regional human rights institutions complement these efforts by providing additional platforms for advocacy and issuing key legal decisions that uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples, especially concerning land, consent, and cultural identity. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has issued numerous recommendations to national and regional human rights institutions over the years. For example, the forum recommended that national human rights institutions and commissions address Indigenous peoples' issues and include Indigenous experts as members of such bodies. The Permanent Forum recommended that the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights recognize the human rights of Indigenous peoples in the ASEAN Declaration on Human Rights and establish a working group on Indigenous peoples. The Permanent Forum encouraged national human rights institutions to work with Indigenous peoples to develop strategies to protect and provide support to Indigenous human rights defenders. The Permanent Forum appreciated the participation and active input of national and regional human rights institutions and encouraged those institutions to prepare studies and reports in the promotion and protection of Indigenous peoples' rights and invited those institutions to present their reports and studies in future sessions of the forum. The realization of the rights of Indigenous peoples as outlined in UNDRIP requires more than aspiration. It requires action, institutional commitment, and partnership. National and regional human rights institutions are indispensable allies on this journey. I thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I now turn the floor to my colleague, Binota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to share my general perspectives on this item. I thank you to the panelists, the experts, the delegates, and indigenous peoples representatives who made the intervention on this. I especially thank the chair of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights for their commitment to promote the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the ASEAN framework for the protection and advancement of indigenous peoples' rights. Mr. Chair, while we are taking part in this dialogue, we also heard the statement raised about the identity and recognition issues of indigenous peoples. The identity of indigenous peoples and their rights goes beyond the concept of colonization and decolonization process. One situation involves the persistence of colonization, even after the overseas colonizers have departed or left. The natives who were the victors of the anti-colonization struggles established the independent nation state and often rallied the people within its boundaries to establish one nation, one culture, and one language. The historical reality is that some nation states forcibly integrated territories belonging to indigenous peoples or included them as part of their territorial claims as part of the nation building and state building process. Whatever claims countries have in terms of presence or absence of indigenous peoples, what is clear is that there are groups of peoples who still continue to practice their own cultures and traditions and their livelihoods, which are closely linked with nature, their lands, territories, and resources. They still suffer from racism and discrimination, which are institutionalized in policies and laws and practiced by those from the dominant population. These peoples aspire to pass on their lands, territories, and resources, as well as their language, identities, cultures, and traditions, and also their social and political governance systems to the future generations. Even if they are not recognized by the state as indigenous peoples, they can still assert their identities and claim their rights as contained in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other international human rights laws. And these aspirations and demands have to be addressed by the states and the international community. What are indigenous peoples seeking? It is the recognition of their human rights in the nation-state boundary, which are established under international human rights law. National Human Rights Commission or institutions or regional human rights bodies can play vital roles in this. In countries where indigenous peoples have been struggling for recognition of their human rights to survive with respect and dignity in line with international human rights law as distinct peoples, I encourage member states to consider inviting and engaging with EMRIP, encouraging the National Human Rights Commission with resources to engage for indigenous people's human rights. This joint engagement will help advancing indigenous people's human rights, including clarification and explanation for developing laws, policies, and constitutional development on indigenous people's rights at the national level. The Constitution is the highest law in the national legal context and provides a framework, and the constitutional recognition of indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples will provide an avenue for indigenous peoples to enjoy their human rights and for the development of a domestic legal and policy framework. I encourage member states to be more open and inclusive for indigenous peoples. States should not see indigenous peoples as their enemy, but as a friend and partner, collaborating in advancing their human rights in harmony with their culture, language, and identity. I thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to South Africa. South Africa, if you are in the room, you have the floor. I think we don't see.
The room, sorry, Chair. My computer froze. Thank you very much, Chairperson. My delegation thanks the panelists for their invaluable insights shared with us this morning. Our democratic country emerged from centuries of colonialism and apartheid that ensured that social groups were hierarchically graded and that some had a heritage that was not freely appreciated and promoted. The cultural heritage of people indigenous to South Africa was in the past marginalized and demonized by colonizers. This also affecting critical aspects of our traditions and heritage linked to land ownership, language, use, livelihoods, and social structures. The South African Human Rights Commission has been involved in monitoring the realization of rights of indigenous peoples in South Africa, and since its inauguration in 1995 has been very active. South Africa stands as one of the few countries on the continent that has embarked on ambitious efforts aimed at redressing the problems of indigenous peoples, including through legislative, policy, and judicial interventions. Our young democracy has made many gains, and we are equally aware that we have much to do to achieve a fully democratic, non-racial, non-sexist society, a future that we all dream of and are responsible for making a reality. In light of this pursuit for an inclusive and equitable society, our democratic government has made a series of sectoral advancements, which include the implementation of a range of measures to build social cohesion, increasingly introducing indigenous languages in public schools, with over 2,400 targeted in this term of government. This aims to foster a greater understanding of different cultures between learners and break down cultural barriers. Chairperson, UNESCO declared the year 2022 to 2032 as an international decade of indigenous languages. The declaration provides an opportunity for us all to intensify ways in which we develop, preserve, and promote our South African indigenous languages to reach the status of the world-acclaimed languages of business. As I conclude, I wish to say that as a country, we will continue with these endeavors, not only to embrace our culture, heritage, and indigenous knowledge, but also to safeguard the interests of the kind of future that we aspire for, a future rooted in democracy, social cohesion, economic prosperity, and enhanced unity in our diversity. I thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now turn the floor to my colleague, Antonina.
Спасибо большое, господин председатель.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to thank everyone for this discussion. I thank you for the substantive statements by panelists and for the statements made by participants. It is hard to overstate the importance of NHRIs. What is especially important is building effective, involved dialogue, both with the state and directly with indigenous peoples themselves. We should welcome the inclusion of indigenous peoples and international standards on indigenous peoples in the work of NHRIs. As mentioned by the representative of the Circumpolar Council of the Inuit, we should also welcome the creation of such institutions at the initiative of indigenous peoples themselves that are culturally acceptable to them. It is important to ensure the rights of indigenous peoples through the appointment of their own experts in these institutions. We heard some significant examples today of this approach. Many speakers, and indeed my colleagues, mentioned today that we need to ensure sufficient resources for a mandate to be fulfilled, to ensure the independence of NHRIs, their recognition by local indigenous peoples' communities. We need to ensure that there is good potential in these institutions to assess problems, to promote solutions, to work for legislative amendments and promote other initiatives. In the context of this discussion, we also heard about our current study and on the issue of data and collection and disaggregation and the role that could be played here by NHRIs. We have heard questions similar to mine, and it is, what possibilities are there to overcome challenges relating to a lack of resources? And how can NHRIs prioritize their activities in conditions where there are not sufficient resources? How do you support a balance between national and international work to promote the rights of Indigenous peoples? Thank you.
Thank you for your statements and the questions raised. I now give the floor to Crimean Tatar Resource Center.
Thank you, dear Chairman. I would like to draw your attention to the role of national and regional human rights institutions in the implementation of the declaration, using the example of Ukraine and Europe. Since 2014, Ukraine has taken important steps, adopted the law of indigenous peoples of Ukraine based on the principles of declaration, created state mechanism for developing policies to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. These changes have occurred due to the active participation of indigenous peoples, organizations, the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, human rights institution, the Ombudsman of Ukraine, civil society. However, we are faced with challenges. The Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine has been delaying the process of securing the legal status of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people as a representative body of the indigenous people. The impossibility, the amending the constitution of Ukraine to guarantee the right to self-determination of the Crimean Tatar people due to Russia's military aggression. The lack of access to the territory of Crimea, where the rights of the indigenous people were systematically violated. The ban of Majlis, arrests, forced disappearances. I would like to note the role of regional human rights institutions. Thus, in 2023, the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe prepared a separate report on the situation of the Crimean Tatar people. Thanks to the assistance of European Human Rights Institution, a new version of the law on national minorities was adopted in Ukraine, and articles were introduced into the law on education of Ukraine that provide guarantees of education in the native language of indigenous people. Recommendations to Ukraine to develop a national plan for the implementation of the declaration and complete the process of securing the legal status of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people. To the OSCE, that develop an action plan to improve the situation of indigenous people in the OSCE area. To the UN, they develop a humanitarian response plan for indigenous peoples from the territories of the interstate conflict. Thank you for your attention.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to WIN Sports International.
Thank you very much. Respectful greetings to all delegations. This is a joint statement. Your Excellencies and esteemed members, we want to take this time to uplift as a good practice recent events in Treaty 6 territory. For example, the Indigenous Justice Symposium on Regaining Legal Sovereignty as hosted by the Samson Cree Nation and the International Indigenous Resource Development. Secondly, the Alberta Court of Justice Access to Justice through an Indigenous Lens Symposium and the Alberta Indigenous Justice Strategy. Thirdly, the Nipsicopak Treaty Police Framework and Nipsicopak Treaty Police Act as submitted at the 17th session of the expert mechanism under the theme of Article 38. These initiatives support the recognition and implementation of a treaty-based approach to policing, restorative justice, and traditional courts. We call on national and regional human rights institutions, including law foundations and societies, and the juridical systems to comply through the effective implementation of the UN Declaration Articles 3, 27, and 28 to advance and achieve redress, reparation, and reconciliation, and in cooperation, good faith, and in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations. Finally, we would recommend the creation of new legal space for the establishment of a Cree Nehiyaw Treaty-based Human Rights Commission and a Treaty Commissioner to monitor and oversee the positive enforcement of Treaty Number 6 of 1876 and the 1877 adhesion thereto, in accordance with the UN and American Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Articles 37 and 24, respectively. We thank you very kindly through you, Mr. Chairman. Hi. Merci, nakumik, gracias, and thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Argentina.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. In compliance with our Constitution and with our law as a national body and in line with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I'd like to share with all of you 3 good practices. First of all, the National Institute for Indigenous Affairs sets up the Federal Council for Indigenous Policies as a space for dialogue and cooperation between the national government and the various provinces to implement policies to favour Indigenous peoples. This council seeks to coordinate actions and programmes to guarantee compliance with the rights of Indigenous peoples in full respect for their identity and culture. Resolution 6 of 2024 constitutes and sets up the Interministerial Board of Indigenous Peoples under the aegis of the National Council of Indigenous Affairs. This is responsible for an overview of Indigenous communities' affairs and the definition of the priority areas to be tackled, the drawing up of joined-up initiatives with the aim of promoting synergies and using current resources sufficiently and efficiently is also a priority. Coordination with provincial governance is a priority to set up a council which seeks to make effective policies targeting communities and the establishment of joined-up strategies with communities in order to fully guarantee the participation of Indigenous peoples in issues relating to their well-being. Also, the ILO has worked in coordination with the Federal Council, and this in order to determine local competences, in order to create spaces to enable civil servants to ensure full, prior and informed consent with Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you for your statements. I now give the floor to Congress Mondial Amazik.
Honorable assistant. Le Congrès mondial.
Distinguished participants, the World Amazigh Congress welcomes this initiative to debate and discuss the role of NHRIs and regional human rights institutions in achieving the objectives of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In spite of the vote in favor of the declaration by North African states. Neither these states nor NHRIs recognize the rights of the indigenous peoples of North Africa. This is a first violation of this declaration, and thereby all of the rights arising from it. Recognition is an essential precondition for implementation and full respect of the rights of indigenous peoples, including the right to self-determination and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. For instance, now in Algeria, the National Human Rights Council, CNDH in French, has not covered any of the grave and repeated violations of the rights and freedoms of the Amazigh people, namely the Kabyle people, including condemnation, death sentences following arbitrary trials. This has not been condemned by the CNDH. The Algerian CNDH has been demoted to B status by the relevant authorities. The rolling back of freedom in Algeria that has been denounced by international entities and human rights defense organizations. For instance, the criminal code criminalizes any peaceful action and gives the authorities of Algeria the right to violate freedom of expression and freedom of identity. It is prohibited to stay in Algeria that you are Amazigh and assert your identity. Hundreds of Amazigh people, mainly Kabyle, women, children, young people, journalists, lawyers, are harassed by the Algerian justice system and punished. Peaceful movements such as for Kabyle self-determination are considered terrorist movements, which is a real headhunt and is arbitrary in nature. The CNDH has not produced any study about the rolling back of freedoms, racism, discrimination, and almost systematic oppression of Amazigh people. It is therefore not acting at all as a watchdog and a defender of human rights. It only repeats government discourse. And there was a request to uphold Amazigh people's rights that has gone unanswered by CNDH. We call for this institution to be in conformity with NHRI rules and with the UN UNDRIP. Thank you.
Thank you for your statements. I now give the floor to Public Organization of the Kanti Mansiast Autonomous Okrug Yugra.
Господин председатель,
Chair, I represent the indigenous peoples of the Khanty Maisisk region. In our region, there are 32,000 representatives of indigenous peoples of the far north. This is less than 1% of the region's population. I would like to congratulate the panelists on your achievement in the area of human rights. For a long time, the UNDRIP indigenous people have been closely following the institution of the Indigenous Peoples Commissioner in their region, and especially access to justice in this light. For more than 10 years, we've discussed the creation of such an institute in our region, but we have not managed to convince the government. The government last year, the new governor of Yugra supported our initiative, a law was adopted, and just a week ago, the parliament appointed the first ombudsman. The president of our organization, Ludmila Alfiorova, now holds the position. She represents indigenous peoples, and we put great hopes on the institution of the ombudsman to defend our rights, to rectify legislative mistakes, to uphold the rights of indigenous peoples at the level of Russia's regions and in international fora. We've heard mention of the rights of Indigenous peoples in the context of industrial activities. This is another critically important topic for national rights NHRIs. Taking into account the recommendations of UNDRIP, we also believe that there's a contribution in access to justice by the Assembly of Indigenous Peoples of the Far North, a regional parliament. The members are Indigenous persons, and they work on drafts that cover the interests and rights of Indigenous peoples and ensure their implementation. One of the members of the Assembly is the chair of the parliament. There's also been a council of the Indigenous peoples of the Far North that has been set up. They discuss legislative and other issues before they are adopted. A commission has also been set up on traditional land use. This deals with projects in indigenous lands and takes into account the views of households consisting of Indigenous peoples. We recommend that EMRIP conduct a study into the role of NHRIs in achieving the objectives of the declaration. We also recommend that EMRIP use its powers to facilitate dialogue between Indigenous peoples, governments, and private companies, creating the necessary conditions and mechanisms to consider complaints with due diligence. Thank you.
I thank you for your statement. In the interest of time, I would like to give the floor to one speaker and then turn the floor to the panelists who've been patiently and attentively listening to your comments and questions, for them also to respond to some of the questions and comments that you've given. So now I would like to give the floor to National Papua Verining, West New Guinea.
Oh, yes, thanks, yes.
Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairperson and respected delegating. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here in the forum. I am attend this forum as a representative of the indigenous people of the Eastern Indonesia, namely the province of Central Papua in the mountains region. In the particular, I represented the Papuan minority who have been politically opposite to the government. The conflict in the mountain region is still ongoing. And this is a matter of great concern to the Indonesian government. This politically motivated conflict has result and numerous consolidated amongst the indigenous Papuans people and non-Papuans residents. To address this political conflict and violence, I'm requesting the Indonesian government representative persons at this forum to facilitate political negotiation with the national government of West Papua led by Simon Sepioper and the National Liberation Army commanded by Puro Okimbowenda. Because the region led by Commander Puro Okimbowenda has unilateral declared the Lanijaya region in Central Papua in the mountain to be outside the geographic territory of the sovereign states of the Republic of Indonesia. Indigenous people of Lani have long recognized the national government of Republic of West Papua as the governing authority of the region. Therefore, I propose the following in this forum. I emphasize that we are willing to negotiate with Indonesian government, and we urgent the representative of the Indonesian government to take this matter seriously and contact us. I thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I would like now to give back the floor to the panelists for concluding remarks and reactions to what they've heard in the room. Again, in the interest of time, you will have only 3 minutes, which, you know, might not be fair given what you've heard and the questions that have been raised, but I hope you would be able to give your concluding remarks in 3 minutes. The first, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Broderstan for your concluding remarks. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try to highlight or say something about the independence from Gandhi's side. Expert Lightfoot asked a question about how we can safeguard the independence as NHRIs, as Gandhi, and as states. So firstly, I need to underline that states have a responsibility to ensure and maintain or create environments that NHRI can operate independently and in line with the Paris principles. That is very important. And then there is this Paris principles endorsed by the UN General Assembly in 1993. And one of the most important criteria here is formal and functional independence. And this is the international benchmark for the establishment and operation of independent NHRIs. Beyond the Paris principles, NHRIs can safeguard their independence from government through combination of legal, financial, structural, and operational measures. This includes enshrining their mandate and autonomy in the constitution or a higher legal frameworks, securing budget allocations directly from Parliament, and ensuring transparent, merit-based, and pluralistic appointment processes. And NHRI should have the freedom to set their priorities, access information and communities without restrictions, and publish reports without government approval. Accountability should be to the public, not executive, and legal protection must shield staff from retaliation. And also, I would like to say that engaging with international and regional mechanism like Gandhi, EMRIP, and fostering a strong internal culture of integrity further reinforce their ability to act independently, particularly in defending the rights of indigenous peoples. I have a bit time left. I would also just highlight that that NHRI's grounding in national frameworks play also a vital role when we are trying to apply UNDRIP in ways that are responsive and their specific legal and in their specific legal and political systems, while try to support the broader objective of advancing the rights of indigenous peoples. Yeah, I can stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for those concluding remarks. I now give the floor to Madame Buba for your concluding remarks.
Thank you, Chair. I would also want to respond to Cheryl on her questions of independence of the institution when we are funded by government. It's true that the independence is guaranteed by the law that created the institution, but practically the institutions can have limitations. We can have obstructions in performing our duties. We have had such obstructions before the institution was reformed in 2019. Around 2018, we were going through a lot of crises. We had insurgencies from secessionists in 2 regions of our country, and we also have attacks from terrorists coming from Nigeria, attacking the country in the far north of our country. And we had, there were many secessionists who were arrested in Nigeria and brought back to Cameroon. And we tried to use our mandate, our protection mandate, to visit them, to verify their conditions of detention. But we did everything and we were refused access to these detainees, so alleged secessionists. So we couldn't visit them for a long time until they were finally taken to incarcerated in prisons. That is the only, after 2021, that we could visit them. We visited them several times and we could discuss with them. With the reform of the institution, the powers of the institution were reinforced by giving us access to detention places without prior notice or even without being accompanied by the prosecutor. So, and also enlarging the places of detention to other places, to several other places which are not traditional places of detention. So at least the powers of the institutions have been strengthened, and then politicians were removed because we had our commission was very, very plethoric. The number of members were plethoric. We were 30, and then it was reduced to half, and the politicians were removed because those politicians were the people who were obstructing the work of the commission. They will always report. Anytime we want to do some work, they have already called their people to report that this is what the commission is planning to do. So this also helped us. And then the budget of the commission is in the budget of the government. It is a line in the budget of the government presented by the Prime Minister of the country before the Parliament for adoption. It's true that the budget has been increased by 300%, even though it's still not enough because we have 10 regional bodies and 1 divisional body. So we have, it has increased, and personnel also, we have also increased. The personnel is higher, so the budget is still limited. We also adopted strategies how we could also go around some of these obstacles. So we have partnership with the Parliament. It is also a recommendation by the one of the principles, I think, the Belgrade principles recommend that national human rights institutions should cooperate and collaborate with the Parliament. So we are collaborating with the Parliament, and through the Parliament, we can also lobby that they should plead for our budget to be increased. We also work with the government. We work with the government. We can always meet the government. We can meet the Prime Minister, and we also have a strategy that towards the end of the year, we ask for an increase of our budget. We try to show them that the budget is, we have exhausted our budget, and we have still activities to do. So the government gives us an addition to our budget every year, and that permits us to carry out several activities through the end of the year and even early the year that follows. So those are the ways that we have. We have also done a lot of sensitization on the institution because the institution was not known. Before, the government agencies thought that we are an NGO. But since 2021, we have at least put the point clear for the government to know we are not an NGO, we are an institution. We are a public institution, independent public. So right now, they respect us, they know who we are, and they are ready to collaborate. So that's how we have gone around the problem. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you for the statement and apologies for the interruption. I now give the floor to Mr. De Yukarev for your concluding remarks. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank everyone who spoke for actively setting out their positions on promoting the role of NHRIs. I would like to thank Dr. Lightfoot and Ms. Gabonova for the questions you put to us. Those are indeed important. You asked how we monitor the implementation of our recommendations that we make to government entities, to governors, deputies of the parliaments. First, these recommendations are put and adopts a decision which mandates the compulsory fulfillment of these by government entities if these recommendations relate directly to them. And each year, at the end of the year, I request information from agencies on how they worked with my recommendations. Of course, there are cases where recommendations for one reason or another are ignored, but in such cases, we enjoy support from our governor and the chair of the government, who once again draw attention to the problem. On resources for our institute, this is provided by our parliament. Each year they adopt a budget, earmarking funds, which allow me to visit the traditional lands of indigenous peoples, to publish my reports, and carry out other human rights defense activities. In addition, I have local authorized representatives who assist me. These might be elders or persons who are particularly active, who provide information directly from the locations where something has occurred. And they do this quite swiftly. Sometimes we get a report at night and we have to wake up and then respond in the morning to violations. In addition, I would like to note that we cooperate actively with the Human Rights Ombudsman, with Ms. Moskalkova, and at the regional level as well. Several times a year, we travel and take part in the work of the Coordinating Council of the Human Rights Ombudsman's Office. And sometimes we cooperate with the Children's Rights Ombudsman, the Entrepreneurs Ombudsman, and we work with other social groups too. Thank you.
Thank you for your concluding statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Waipoti for your concluding statement. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge all the stories, the ancestors in making, and Indigenous peoples in this room who have shared today, in strength, struggle, and continuing existence that thread us all together as Indigenous peoples. The details of struggle may look different in different places, but it's the same struggle against colonialism and racism and our right to just exist. It can manifest as structural racism or as Indigenous peoples dying early from preventable causes, overt rejection of Indigenous rights and international frameworks from governments of the day. And we know with the genocide occurring in the world right now that overt colonial violence is explicit attempts to eradicate Indigenous peoples. But we are not going anywhere. We are creative, we are strong, we are loving, and we are. Our lands remember us, our rivers remember us, even when we are displaced. There's collective strength here, even in our collective struggle. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, kia tātou. In relation to your question, Partai Dr. Lightfoot, the question on how we as a national human rights institution at New Zealand monitor impact in upholding our human rights and Indigenous rights. One of the ways we do that is the New Zealand Human Rights Commission is measured by the experience of our Indigenous peoples, an approach to reaffirm nation-to-nation relationships envisioned under Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We do this by asking them of their experience on our work, and that is one of the core measures for us. Our role as New Zealand's Human Rights Commission is to support the implementation of human rights standards domestically. Our focus is on our leaders realizing the potential of human rights and Indigenous rights to lead to better outcomes for everyone. It is concerning to sit here before you today knowing that comments coming from our government at this moment in time appear to be undermining the framework of the United Nations. Therefore, the Commission requests again that the EMRIP not be deterred by the New Zealand government's lack of response to proceed with a follow-up visit. It is needed more so than ever. We will continue to urge and support the government to cooperate fully with the EMRIP's follow-up country visit, because urgent action is needed to protect human rights in Te Tiriti o Waitangi in New Zealand's constitutional framework. Human rights and obligations under the treaty, under Te Tiriti and UNDRIP do not yield depending on the government of the day, but greater constitutional protection is needed. We welcome today's focus on strengthening collaboration. As Indigenous people, we can be hopeful. We can draw on the continued strength of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We have the right to our culture, to our language, and to our lands. We always have and always will be the right to our indigeneity and our sovereignty. Until we all have that right, we are not free. Nā reira, kia whakakotahi te whatumanoa, kia mahia ngāhiri, kia tū rangatira ai, mauri ora tēnā koutou.
Thank you for your concluding statement. And I think we would like to thank all the panelists for the contributions and good practices, but also the challenges you've raised. I think the session has benefited from your expertise, knowledge, and experiences, but also to all of you for the questions that you've raised, the comments, and also your respective experiences that you've shared. So without any further ado, I think we now bring this session to close. And we wish you very good and, bon appetit lunchtime. Thank you.
Thank you.